Good afternoon, friends. My name is Jeff Cassman. Welcome to Tradition. I'm here with my friend Jim DePiante. Jim, say hi.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad to be back.
Jim took an extended break to visit Italy and go on a pilgrimage. We'll talk about that at some point. But welcome to Tradition. This is a series of conversations for people who are new to tradition or interested in learning about the traditions of the Catholic Church. Over the last 70 years, much of the church has abandoned the practices that had helped her to evangelize the world and convert billions to the Catholic faith. A small percentage of Catholics have held on to those traditions, and we are exploring what those traditional practices and beliefs are, the history behind them, and the purpose of those doctrines and practices. So if you're new to the faith, or you're new to tradition, or you just want to know more about the traditional Catholic faith, this is the place to you. Welcome. Now, in our first several episodes, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the various kinds of masses, the various levels of solemnity of the Mass that you might see, low Mass and high Mass and Missa cantatas and all of these kinds of things. We've talked about why you might see some diversity of conduct at those Masses. We've talked about the proper gestures and postures that are used at Mass, fasting and abstinence practices, the liturgical year, the season of Paschal Tide. And we've covered some other things outside the liturgy. We've talked about the Divine Mercy devotion and problems with recent canonizations. We've talked about how parents should practice their faith when they're taking children to Mass, infants and young children. And we've also talked about things like the criteria to become a martyr. What does it really mean? In the United States, especially, our language changes frequently and quickly, and people use that word martyr all the time without really thinking about what it means. And we've talked about this kind of strange situation under the current pontificate with Pope Francis, where on the one hand, he seems to despise tradition, and on the other hand, he seems to be very fond and generous towards the SSPX. That's an interesting one. The last episode, we talked about Ember Days. Now, Jim was in Italy, so Louis Tafari stopped by and explained the history of Ember Days and what that's all about. It was a great episode. You should go back and watch that, episode 19. Today is episode 20.
And where are we going today, Jeff?
Well, it's October the 20th, and I know my social media feeds, and I suspect yours as well, are filling up with rage and anger, and I've been excommunicated again by
you too.
by a very angry homeschooling mom because we started talking about Halloween. So,
oh dear. Why we shouldn't celebrate it? Yeah, I was already castigated on one particular Facebook group because it suggested ways in which Catholics should celebrate Halloween, and didn't I know that it was satanic?
It was satanic. Okay, so I'm guessing you're going to tell us today that Halloween is not actually satanic.
Truly, it's not. But to get at why it's not, maybe we should start by talking about vigils.
Vigils, what a great topic, because among many of the things that have been lost in the last 70 years as a result of the liturgical changes, we have lost the entire sense, the whole notion of a vigil that comes before a feast. And people don't realize this, because how could you know what you don't know, right? It's just gone. And tell us what, can we talk about that subject a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, very, very briefly put, the observance of the most important feasts of the church would begin actually the day before the vigil of the feast, the day before the feast, as a time of penitential preparation. This is very, very common in the liturgy. So we have, before the great feast of Easter, we have Lent as a time of preparation. Before the Feast of the Ascension, we have the Rogation Days. Before all of the major feasts of the church, we had vigils. Days before the feast, days of penance. There used to be a lot of them. Considerably more than half of them were eliminated in the 1955 missal, and more still were eliminated in subsequent missals.
And let's talk about the word itself. Vigil kind of conjures to mind this whole idea that we're going to be vigilant, right? That
we're watching and waiting.
Yeah, which, the church is so extraordinary in this, as we talk about the liturgical years, about preparing for what's coming, which makes sense instead of just kind of, oh, it's here sort of thing. And so in her wisdom in the old days, she had these vigils so that we could really be thinking about just the very next day and how to properly prepare ourselves for that.
Recollection is an important part of the spiritual life, and so the whole idea of the vigil was to become recollected and to give some thought to what was about to come, whether it was the vigil of the protracted vigils of Advent and Lent, or just a single day before a feast.
And for our conversation today, among those that were removed, half of them were removed, I think you said. The one that we're going to talk about is the Vigil of the Feast of All Saints.
It's gone. It's gone, and it's an important vigil.
So what can we talk about the Feast of All Saints? What can we say about that as a kind of an intro to this topic?
Well, in the scheme of things, the Feast of All Saints is one of the holiest days of the year. We lose sight of that, but in fact, in the universal church, there are only 10 holy days of obligation, and there's not one jurisdiction, I'll refer to it as, that actually celebrates all 10. In the United States and Canada, we only celebrate 6. And even many of those now in modern times are simply combined with the nearest Sunday. So of all of these days in the year that are among the holiest, we have the Feast of All Saints, and that ranks it not far below Christmas, the Feast of the Assumption, the Feast of the Ascension. So it's one of the preeminent feasts.
And so we oftentimes among traditional circles, people are going to refer to this as one of the Feast of Forgotten Saints, right? The
saints who are not otherwise on the calendar, right?
Yeah. And as you mentioned, we also celebrate Our Lady and the angels and all the saints.
On this particular day, it's all saints, not the forgotten saints.
Yeah.
So what about the vigil?
So the Vigil of All Saints, because of its importance as a feast, you've already mentioned that all saints merited a vigil before the feast. That's one more indication of how solemn this event is.
And that vigil is Halloween. So how do we get, in terms of language, how do we get from the Vigil of All Saints to this rather peculiar word Halloween?
Yeah, so you don't have to be a linguist to follow this. Hallowed means holy. We see this word in the Our Father, of course. Hallowed be thy name. So it gives us an indication of we're treating our Lord with great reverence, right? Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. We're referring to holy is the name.
So if hallowed means holy, and the word saint is quite literally Latin for holy, Latin origin,
makes sense that English speakers the day before All Saints or All Saints Day itself would refer to as All Hallows. Right?
And the vigil, therefore,
the vigils would be All Hallows Evening, shortened to Halloween.
Isn't that great?
Simple.
So, given that All Hallows, All Saints is on November 1st, that necessarily puts the vigil Halloween on October 1st. October 31st.
October 31st. So one of the things we've talked about in previous episodes was how some of our days have come to be on the calendar, when and where and why. Certainly in the last episode with Louis Tafari, we talked about Ember Days and how they came to be in the calendar. But there's also a great history behind most of these feast days. Has All Saints always been on November 1st?
In fact, no. And to understand why it is now on November 1st, it helps to understand what exactly it is that's being commemorated. In the earliest days of the church, martyrs, and as we've pointed out, initially only martyrs were celebrated as saints. And so it happened in the earliest days of the church that groups of martyrs would be celebrated together. Those who were martyred together, or those who were martyred in dioceses that were near each other. And so they sort of amalgamated the celebration of these various martyrs. That was done as early as the 4th century. So groups of saints were commemorated as martyrs as early as the 4th century. In 609, Pope Boniface was granted permission by the Byzantine emperor to convert the Pantheon in Rome into a Catholic church, dedicated to and now known as Our Lady and All the Martyrs.
And so the Pantheon, a Roman temple originally, Pantheos, we can dig through that and see kind of the origins, the linguistic origins of that, to all the gods, converted to a Catholic church in honor of all the martyrs.
I love that. I love that. In fact, when you go, and I was just there. In fact, when you go to the Pantheon in Rome and you look for anything that says the Pantheon on it, you're not going to see it. The little nondescript sign that you see at the entrance of the Pantheon says the Church of Our Lady and the Martyrs, which brings me great happiness.
That's
Obviously,
great.
They use their heads that have been dedicated to all the gods, all of the Roman gods, pantheos from the Greek, to then a church in honor of all of the saints.
Love it.
So that the event of the dedication of the Pantheon in Rome as now Our Lady and All the Martyrs, the Catholic Church of Our Lady and All the Martyrs, was commemorated on May 13th. Subsequently, Pope Gregory III consecrated a chapel in the Basilica of St. Peter's to all the saints, and essentially moved the feast that had originally been the commemoration of the Pantheon as a church of all the saints, moved that then to November 1st.
So what we really celebrate on November 1st is the dedication of the Chapel of All Saints in St. Peter's
Basilica. That's right. A feast so important that it is a holy day of obligation and used to have a vigil. And oh, by the way, it was one of the very few that also had an octave, both of which we've lost. So we had a day of preparation before, and then not just a single day to celebrate, but 8 full days from the day itself, then the week subsequent, and then finally consummated on the 8th day, the octave. Yeah.
And so not to belabor this point too much, but since it's relevant to what we're talking about, so we've got this great feast, we've got an octave, we've got the vigil before the feast, and the Vigil of All Saints is Halloween.
That's exactly right.
So it doesn't sound to me, based on this history that you've given, I mean, it sounds pretty holy, not holy in an ordinary way, but
particularly holy.
Yeah. So how do we go from there with that history of All Saints Day and All Hallows Eve and the octave to finding some Catholics, indeed traditional Catholics, who really, I think, want to know the truth? How do we get from the history you've just given us to the point where people are actually calling Halloween satanic?
Well, in modern times, and this crazy association of the feast with the satanic actually originates with the rabidly anti-Catholic Jack Thomas Chick. Then, from Jack Chick, via evangelical Protestants, it was imported into traditional Catholic circles by, we'll say, well-meaning Catholics who really don't know their faith.
So you're talking about Jack Chick. This is Catholics that grown up in the South, especially here in Nashville, Tennessee, where I grew up. The kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt. We've all run into Jack Chick publications. He would publish these tracts,
these cartoon tracts,
little cartoons and little tracts. Protestants would buy them. Really more fundamentalists in most cases back in those days, but but would buy them and, would go door to door and, tell Catholics about all their satanic, practices, and would flood, parking lots with them and so forth. So that's the origin, the modern origin of this whole concept.
Yep. And he's a nutcase.
Yeah, not what we would call a scholar.
No, a highly influential nutcase, I might add. And he hates Halloween. Every year, in anticipation of Halloween, he republishes. Now, of course, now he has an internet site, and you can go see his stuff, and it's really kind of funny. But he calls Halloween the birthday celebration of Satan, and of course, it's Catholics like sacrificing babies and things.
So I guess the birthday of Satan would be the I don't know that time existed at that. No, there would be no time in heaven, but this must be like the conversion point from where he went from being Lucifer to rebelling, and he became Satan. So that's right. What? Okay.
It's a crazy phenomenon. So there's, we know of ecumenism as sort of this modern post-Vatican II phenomenon, but there's this other kind of weird ecumenism that goes on. A lot of homeschooling traditional Catholics got ostracized from their parish churches. And so ended up, as my family did, to be very honest, we had a choice. We were very early in this homeschooling game, right? There weren't a lot of people doing this at all. And so we had a choice. We could either join homeschool associations that were affiliated with our parish churches.
Yeah.
That didn't work. Or we could go out there with the evangelical Protestants, and that actually worked better. But then there was this kind of weird new ecumenism in which traditional Catholics are out there rubbing elbows with homeschooling evangelicals, and the homeschooling evangelicals just ate this stuff up. And so they have like trunk or treats and all this other crazy stuff because they don't get away from Satan.
Yeah. And that's still the case today, I think, all over the country, not just here in the South. All over the country, it's evangelicals and their efforts with homeschooling associations and umbrella schools that, people can enroll in and so forth. I mean, they still have a major role in that. One that we need to be grateful for. Frankly, if it was not for their presence in the political, secular role, we'd probably all already be in
really bad shape.
Yeah, we'd probably be in concentration camps. I mean, they're now targeting Catholic men who've prayed outside of abortion clinics for open persecution. So you've given us now a very logical explanation of how Catholics kind of picked up on this idea that Halloween had these satanic origins.
And of course, then we have the internet and social media in particular, which serve the purpose of popularizing and promoting these ideas. It really distresses me that so many traditional Catholic sites, and many frankly associated with the various traditional organizations, Society of St. Pius X, Institute of Christ King, Fraternal Society of St. Peter, all of these play host to ostensibly good traditional Catholics who latch onto this stuff and promote it on social media.
Yeah, we really need to. It would be great to explore with a psychiatrist or something about kind of the mass confusion that results from the internet, where the crazier the idea, the more traction it's likely to get. And especially among, let's say, low information, well-meaning people. They know there's something wrong in the world. They see it. They're disgusted by it.
Something to blame it on. There is a whole interesting psychology behind it, but to me, there's one 2-word expression from Holy Scripture that just totally nets it out: itching ears.
Yes.
People want to hear this stuff because it feels good.
Well, and it's a lot easier to delve into those theories and kind of get lost in that than it is to pick up a book on the spiritual life and read for an hour about how much of a miserable sinner you really are. That
it's got a sort of a cachet, a sort of a cool factor to it. Yeah, I know about this. I'm going to tell you why what you're doing is unacceptable. Didn't you know? I mean, didn't you? I mean, that's what I got. Didn't you know that's satanic, Jim? I mean, come on,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. And it gives you something to go talk to people about instead of,
Something meaningful.
yeah. Okay. So one of the things we also hear about Halloween, frankly, it seems now that we hear that about every Catholic holy day, that the more important the holy day, Easter, Christmas, the Pentecost. I mean, the more solemn and grand the event, the more likely we are to hear it's rooted in paganism somehow.
Yeah.
And the people who like to talk about Halloween in this respect say that it grew out of the pagan feast of Samhain.
Well, we don't want to give Jack Hitt too much credit. He's latched onto that like so many others, but that actually originated very shortly after the Protestant Revolution, mainly among the Puritans. I mean, the allegation is idiotic on the face of it. The church had celebrated All Saints at other times of year since the 4th century.
But as you've already explained, the celebration was moved to November 1st, 735, upon the dedication of the Chapel of All Saints in St. Peter's Basilica.
Right, and Samhain wasn't even a thing until after that.
So apparently November 1st was chosen because it came after the harvest time, not because we're trying to tie it into some pagan feast, but because a very practical thing, like any good pastor would think about. We talk about pastoral a lot these days, but the real meaning of pastoral is when the pastor of the church, being so close to his people, he knows them, he understands what's going on. They scheduled this feast for after the harvest so that there wouldn't be a conflict, so that people could come in out of the fields and so forth and participate in the feast and the octave that would come.
And so what is Samhain?
So my guess is it's a festival to mark the end of the harvest.
Yes, that's true. And so Halloween is on October 31st because that's the Vigil of All Saints.
And not because it coincides with Samhain.
Right. And yet we're supposed to believe that the date of the dedication of a chapel in St. Peter's in Rome was chosen to coincide with a pagan feast that really wasn't even a thing yet in faraway Ireland.
Yeah. Yeah. Little revisionist history. So why, we always want to assume the best of people, of course, but why would Puritans want to perpetuate a lie that, at least in 2022, is so easily discredited?
Okay, so let's talk about what All Saints Day and the Vigil are about. I mean, they're about honoring saints, and the very notion of honoring saints is anathema. I mean, Puritans detest this idea that we should honor our dead, the deceased who lived particularly holy lives.
Yeah, so there's an enormous doctrinal issue there that they were raging about, but they did kind of have just that general temperament of being opposed to any sort of merriment or joy or pleasure. God forbid, physical pleasure.
Also in November we have Thanksgiving Day, which was founded, of course, by the Puritans. But why do we have it? A lot of people don't understand this. Yeah, it's a harvest festival. But we have it because the Puritans in the colonies actually abolished Christmas. And it wasn't until the 19th century when Christmas as a holiday was actually restored in what then became the United States, if you can imagine. So, and consider also that the subsequent All Souls Day. So we have Halloween, the Vigil of All Saints Day, in which we honor the dead as our saints and pray to them, which is anathema to the Puritans. But then the following day is all about purgatory and praying for our dead. And that's another belief that was anathema to and detested by Protestants, all Protestants, but the Puritans in particular.
Yeah, they were very doctrinal people, and of course they were very much opposed to the Church of England as well. They saw that as kind of Catholic light, right? And these people were formed really well. Today's Protestants, generally, not all, of course, but especially the non-denominational kinds, have very few doctrinal sort of motivations. So in an odd way, they're going to be less and less hung up about this, but somehow they've transferred the conspiracy theory to believing Catholics. So let's talk a little bit about customs, because that's where this really all kind of plays out. What are the various customs that have been associated with Halloween among Catholics and among Latter-day pagans and so forth?
Now, there's no question that if the church doesn't have a reason to condemn something, she doesn't condemn it. And if something is just not as it ought to be, the church works really hard to figure out a way to Catholicize it. I mean, one of those beautiful cases in point is the feast on May 1st of St. Joseph the Worker. Okay, this was a reaction to the to international communism, which celebrated the Day of the Worker on May 1st. And Pius XII said, "Y'all going to have your Day of the Worker? So are we," and instituted the feast of St. Joseph the Workman, in which Catholics could honor a workman that would detract from, not embrace, but detract from the celebration of the Communist International Feast of the Worker on May 1st.
And then not just detract from, but really ideally overshadow and replace, right?
Absolutely, and just
because
replace it in the minds of good Christians.
Because the Holy Father understood that the communists were brilliant, right? Communism is probably the best.
Propaganda is what they do best.
Yeah, and they've created this whole structure, kind of an anti-church, an ape of the church, in which they take a little bit out of Catholic doctrine, like the idea of protecting workers' rights and paying the worker their just wage and so forth. They've taken that and then they submerge it and immerse it in all sorts of these terrible evil things. So the Holy Father is looking at that and saying, okay, it's right and just for us to counter that, to recognize what they're doing and attempt to replace it and overshadow it. That's right. What that feast day is about.
It is true that some few Halloween customs are, I don't know, we can call them the last vestiges of Celtic observances that persisted in Ireland and England and made their way into North America through immigration. And so certainly they're there, but they're not inherently wrong.
Right. I mean, it would make sense that a lot of the Irish that emigrated, the Scots, the English, would bring some of their customs with them, whether they were Catholic or just local customs.
Right.
But I guess the logic today is, the people who are hating on Halloween, the logic is, if the pagans did it, it must be evil. Therefore, we should not do it.
I've had this conversation a lot of times. I mean, it's Advent wreaths and Christmas trees and so many other things. Look, pagans loved their children. Okay, so we shouldn't. Pagans ate vegetables, and so we shouldn't. That has pagan origins. Pagans had sex, so what? We shouldn't.
Yeah.
Pagans bobbed for apples, and we shouldn't. Come on.
Yeah. Ironically, some of the customs that are most closely associated with Halloween and are most condemned, mostly by Protestants, but certainly there are some Catholics that'll give out those anathemas and excommunications. They're actually of Catholic origin.
Yeah, some of the things that are most criticized as being pagan in origin aren't. So I mean, things like pretending to be ghosts. I mean, come on, what is a ghost? But a spirit of the dead. Well, Catholics believe in that.
Yeah, so a lot of these
holy souls are.
Yeah, a lot of the ghosts, we use ghosts today, maybe sometimes with a little different inference about them, but in the old days, ghosts were like the poor souls in purgatory, wandering creation, in anticipation, they're suffering obviously in anticipation of the day when they'll be able to go to heaven.
Right. So the whole idea of ghosts is very, very much associated with purgatory. The whole idea of scary characters, particularly on the 31st. See, the way this ended up shaping up is the 31st, Halloween, as the vigil, became oriented in a sense toward hell and avoiding it. And so scary characters were intended to mock the devil. So why not be a ghoul if your intent is to mock the devil? Okay, even trick-or-treating. People talk about it like this. It's like extortion. English children would go from house to house begging for what was referred to as a soul cake. And in return for being given a treat, they would commit to pray for the souls of deceased members of that family. I mean, how can that be wrong? So rather than trick or treat, they would say, a soul cake, a soul cake. Have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. I just think that's precious.
I think that's outstanding. I didn't understand the full background on that, but obviously, if every family would have a deceased member of their family that they would want to have prayers for, and
keep in mind, a lot of this grew up in the time of the plague, so people knew death. People understood death. Cemeteries were not some faraway thing. They were in the neighborhood. People saw their cemeteries. They went to visit these cemeteries very, very commonly. So these customs are relatively recent and have no connection with anything that's pagan, and yet they're condemned as being holdovers from Samhain or some stupid thing like that.
Thank you for taking us back to understand the origin of that. And unfortunately, maybe in part because of the general crisis in our church, our Catholic holy times, rather than winning the day and influencing the culture, they're actually being perverted by these forces.
All of our holidays. I mean, Christmas is celebrated in Japan as the birthday of Santa Claus. Unfortunately, Halloween in particular is being utterly divorced from its Catholic roots. It's absolutely being sexualized and it's being paganized. And the really weird thing is those paganizing it are laying claim to a non-existent pedigree in Samhain. And so they're perpetuating this crazy myth.
And of course, all of that lends credence to the lie that Halloween has its roots in pagan practices. I mean, it's diabolical because it's so brilliant.
It's brilliant. And so it's being co-opted by those who would despise what it's really all about.
And so you have this strange situation where traditional Catholics, thinking that they need to kind of be extreme because the mainstream is so messed up, they're saying that we should let those who've perverted the holiday, we should just abandon it. We should let them have it.
Which is the worst thing that we could possibly do. Yeah.
So we find ourselves in this situation. It's October 20th. People are starting to think about that. Kids are asking about, candy and, can I dress up as Superman or whatever. We hear those Catholics who should most cherish the vigil of this great feast saying things like, not just, I don't celebrate Halloween, it's satanic, but you shouldn't. And if you do, you're cast out.
That's satanic. And you'll see it. I've seen it already. I want no part of Halloween. It's evil.
Yeah. Again, we're back to the diabolic. It's the ultimate masterstroke of Satan to trick otherwise well-intentioned people into walking away from holy observances. I mean, I have not asked, but I'm going to. I'm sure I'll have the opportunity in the next 10 days to ask somebody, okay, if you're not recognizing the vigil, All Hallows Eve, what is it you're doing to prepare for that holy day? Can't wait to hear the answer.
Okay, so what is the answer, Jeff? Let's give our viewers, let's give our listeners some suggestions.
Yeah, I would say number one, we need to reconcile ourselves with the truth. Don't give it away. Fight for it. Reclaim it. Take it back. Celebrate it in a big way. Be ready to explain to anybody who asks, regardless of their background, this history that we've just shared. It can be condensed down, right? It's a Catholic, Christian feast that's coming up that we're preparing for.
All right. So how do we celebrate it?
I think the ever popular Saints party is a good one for young and old alike. I think that'd be a great place to start. And certainly, of course, the most important thing would be going to Mass on All Saints Day.
So it is a holy day of obligation, which means we must keep it holy as though it were a Sunday. The best thing that any of us can do is right now, get out your calendar for work, especially you men, get out your work calendars and put the holy days for the coming year on your calendar right now, so you're not scrambling at the last minute to figure out a way to take off for the day. Most of us have no excuse for not taking the day off. Take the day off and observe it with all the solemnity that it merits. And you can start with the vigil.
I think that's a great observation. I'm glad you brought that up. I find I know you're retired or semi-retired, but those of us that are still in the workplace, it's so easy to fall into the secular habits, and of course they're not going to observe these holy days. So you have it in this case, it's a Tuesday. If you have planned the year ahead and blocked those days off, asked for those days off if necessary, now you're starting to act like a Catholic. Now you're starting to make that time, because as you mentioned, it's a holy day in the same way that every Sunday is, in the same way that Easter and Christmas are. And if at all possible, we should take that day off. And I'm glad you mentioned the calendar. There is, at least on Android, I'm sure Apple has it, there is a Roman calendar according to the old calendar that you can automatically overlay on your calendar. I do it in Google, other people in iCalendar.
Among other places, it's available for pretty much any phone operating system out at Angelus Press, and it will, if it's not available already, it will soon be available. And for what it's worth, you cannot live a Catholic life if you don't live it liturgically, and you cannot live a liturgical life if you don't have a liturgical calendar.
Yeah. So if you have any problem finding that, folks, comment on YouTube or social media.
We'll post a link.
We'll give you a link to it. But that's something that it puts not just these holy days of obligation, but in my case, I see every single day, whatever the feast.
It's actually pretty marvelous, because it immediately pops up as an event. But if you click on it, you can go actually read a little bit about the saint, a little meditation. It's actually pretty cool. Okay, so there's no question. Beginning with the eve, and then the day itself, and then so Halloween, All Saints, and then All Souls. We do things that are religious in character, but I don't think you're saying that we should limit ourselves to only religious observances.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessary. I mean, to me, it feels very, very Puritan, very kind of Calvinist, right? Like the iconoclasts, they want to take all that stuff out of not just the churches, but our society as a whole. And, nature abhors a vacuum. So if we retreat from society and we withdraw our holy things and our sacred ideas and our practices, it will be filled by someone, and they will replace it with their own idols and evil practices. So
that's a very, very good point, Jeff. So man is complex. So God is simple. He's only spirit. The angels are simple. Man is complex. He's matter and spirit. And so there is something in us that seeks to satisfy the material, but we quickly find out that that's not adequate. It leaves us unsatisfied. And so we then seek to satisfy the spiritual. And because we've been robbed of so much cultural beauty that is spiritual in nature, people go out looking for it. That's why these people are wrong to find it in trying to tie Halloween to Samhain.
Yeah.
But Halloween is tied to something spiritual, and they're looking for it, and they're looking in all the wrong places. So it's a very good point. So on the more material side, all right, trick-or-treating.
Yeah, why not? I mean, I think number one, it's generally harmless. The activity itself is generally harmless. And, we've done a lot of this over the years. I can't tell you how many times we have found people who have said, the kids go up to the door and the person says, "Oh, well, who are you?" And he says, "I'm St. Joseph." "Who are you?" "I'm Teresa of Avila. What a great opportunity to explain who that is. Well, I've never heard of that, or what is that? And I'm not saying that to do this, you got to dress up as a saint, but that is a great thing.
Okay, but not as a ghoul, right?
Why not? I mean, why not? I mean, if we go back to the origins of this, and we're thinking about the suffering souls in purgatory whose suffering can only be compared to hell, except that it's going to be finite.
Except that it finishes.
Yeah. Or even the souls in hell. I mean, we can't even imagine beyond what the saints have written. I don't think we can even imagine the horror of what that suffering would be like, and who we might be surrounded by. What about dressing up as a stop sign, right? As I don't mean literally, but I mean as a ghoul who is well, who are you? I'm one of the condemned souls in hell. Imagine what somebody would say to that. And I'm not saying again, you have to do that, but I think it does kind of beg the question of what would be so wrong with these things.
It's not a homage. On the contrary. All right. So I remember when I was in Catholic grade school, Jeff, one of the coolest things was the 8th graders, who were the upperclassmen, got to produce a haunted house. What about that? I mean, isn't that a little over the top?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this is an example where if we've abandoned something that in and of itself, some entertainment, maybe with a little bit of scariness, an opportunity to teach, if we abandon that and we leave it only to the bad people in society, then they will turn it into something that is
that it's not.
Yeah. And so here's what I would say, just prudentially about it. Some of these haunted houses can be pretty awful, right? Depicting truly demonic things, showing really awful pornographic and other sort of X-rated horror things. I certainly wouldn't encourage people to do that, but why couldn't why wouldn't every Catholic church in their parking lot have some sort of little Catholic themed haunted house where you go through and there's the individual particular judgment, and here's this poor sinner who was, here was his predominant fault, and then you go to the next one and here's this other. I mean,
maybe being sentenced to a little bit of time in purgatory. Why not?
Kids love that stuff.
They do. People, we're all nuts. I mean, human beings are weird. Like, we actually kind of like to be scared. I mean, that's why there's a genre of films called horror films.
Yeah.
It's one thing to be afraid, but it's another thing to literally put the fear of God in someone. I mean, the fear of God is a gift of the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
You can be on a mission from God on Halloween and put the fear of God in children. Why not?
Yeah. What a great response to either the Protestants or to Catholics who don't know better. What a great response on Halloween when they're out there passing out Jack Chick tracts and so forth, for you to be there as an apologist for the Catholic faith and explaining in a charitable and patient way what the true history is. And oh, by the way, please meet Saint Mary Magdalene or whomever the kids are dressed up as.
Or these poor souls.
And indeed, what do you think about? There's a practice, a history rather, the tradition of certain penitential practices on vigils in preparation for a feast. If this is a great feast, what for folks who maybe they're not going out trick-or-treating, maybe they don't have young children, they're kind of beyond this phase in their life, what might be some other traditional penitential ways that they could observe Halloween in preparation for that feast?
Well, there's no question that vigils, this is very interesting, but if you look in your missal on vigils, the first thing you'll know is that if it's going to be a sung mass on a vigil, it's going to be Mass 18, which is a variant of Mass 17, which is for Advent and Lent. And the liturgical color is purple. So on the day before gold, I mean, there's no question, All Saints' Day is a white feast. And it's such a big white feast. By white, I mean that the priest and the altar are vested in white. It's such a big deal that you would choose gold, which is a liturgical alternative to white, for major feasts. Okay. So the day before, gold, just like for 4 weeks before Christmas, purple. For 6 weeks before Easter, purple. The day before a big deal feast, purple. Violet. I should say violet. What does that tell you immediately? Fast and abstinence. Treat it as and it used to be indistinguishable from a day of Lent. So no eating between meals, no meat or meat once. And there's so many things in tradition that are based on this idea of the vigil. I mean, even Christmas. So a lot of folks know that it's an Italian custom to have seven fish dishes before on the day before on Christmas Eve. The reason for that was because you didn't eat meat.
Right.
So don't eat meat. Make some other sacrifice. Certainly, prayer. In general, you don't want to fool with when you say the various mysteries of the Rosary, but it would be fitting on a vigil to choose rather the sorrowful mysteries and then the glorious on the day of the feast. Anything that you might otherwise do that's penitential.
Yeah, that's great. Folks, we've been talking about All Saints Day and the history in our church of vigils in advance of preparing for that feast day, and then the octave that oftentimes would follow. So much of this has been lost in our tradition. It's no longer obligatory, but it is meritorious. It's a great thing that you should do. Remember that the law is the bare minimum. So much of what we talk about is for those folks who have a desire to understand more than the minimum, who have a desire to go above what the minimum is and practice these things that have proven to be so good in our history. Jim, anything else you want to share?
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween to you. I do want to make one final comment, folks. If you like what we're doing here, please like the channel on YouTube, like it and share it on your social media. If you have really positive feedback about how these things have helped you, please email me, jeffcastman@gmail.com. If you have criticism, please email
me.
You can find Jim on Facebook, and you can share those constructive criticisms with him. Jim, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jeff, and likewise. God bless you. God bless you all.
Everybody have a blessed day.